The only reason I'm still breathing is because she didn't follow orders. Blood dripped from Kyle's jaw onto the cold metal floor. He'd been strapped to that chair for 8 hours. Beaten. Burned. Broken. But he never talked. Until she walked in. She wasn't like the others. Tall. Regal. Eyes sharp like knives. The room went still when General Misenna appeared. She didn't ask. She didn't threaten. She just looked at him. "You should be dead," she said. "You stopped them," he whispered back. "Why?" She didn't answer. She didn't have to. Because in the data he stole, her name was there. Not just once, a full classified file. And what he said next changed everything. "Your government thinks you've gone soft." She froze. No one else had dared to say that. And in that moment, the chains that held him were nothing compared to the grip he had on her mind. And that's how a human prisoner and an alien general, sworn enemies, began a war of secrets, loyalty, and something far more dangerous than betrayal. Feeling. The room was cold, an eerie chill that seeped into Kyle's bones, making his muscles stiff with every breath. Beneath him, the metal floor was slick with blood, his own. His head throbbed from the punch that had sent him sideways, but he refused to let out a sound. He wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. The underground chamber was quiet except for the steady click of boots echoing off the steel walls. 2 guards, their skin a sickly green, paced back and forth like predators circling their prey. Each carried a neural heat pulsar, a device designed to ignite the very nerve endings in your body one pulse at a time. Kyle knew the feeling well, the way it sears, burns, and shatters your sense of control. But still, he stayed silent. One of the guards stopped in front of him, the pulsar tapping against his cheek, almost like a mockery. "He's human," the guard growled. "They always talk eventually." Kyle spat blood, the crimson streak a defiance against them. "Guess I missed that memo," he muttered through clenched teeth. Without warning, another fist collided with his ribs, sending shockwaves of pain through his body. But Kyle didn't flinch. His arms were strapped to a chair bolted into the floor, his shirt torn from earlier rounds of interrogation. Blood stained his chest, his vision hazy, but his spirit remained intact. "Where is the data?" The voice of the lead interrogator hissed from the shadows. Kyle's eyes locked with his, and a faint smirk tugged at his lips. "Burned it," he replied, blood staining his teeth. "Right after I downloaded your general's secrets." The interrogator's face twisted into a snarl. "Wrong answer," he hissed. Pain exploded in Kyle's head. A flash of white, then black. Darkness swallowed him whole. When he came to, he was still slumped in a chair, his wrists raw from the restraints. The guards were gone. The room was silent once more, and Kyle's mind spun as he struggled to regain his bearings. His head felt like it was filled with cotton, but one thought cut through the haze like a knife. "You're lucky the general wants you alive," a voice whispered in his ear. Kyle turned his head slowly, his vision blurred. A younger guard stood in the doorway, his expression twisted into a grin. "What?" Kyle rasped, barely able to speak. The guard's smirk deepened. "They were going to kill you, put your pieces on display as a warning. But someone changed the order." "Which means," he leaned in close, his breath hot against Kyle's ear, "you're more important than they thought." The guard vanished before Kyle could respond, leaving him alone once more with his thoughts. The silence in the room was thick, suffocating, but Kyle was far from defeated. He had something they didn't understand. Something buried deep in the encrypted chip, a secret far more dangerous than they could imagine. If the rumors were true, and he had every reason to believe they were, if the woman keeping him alive was really who they said she was, then this was just the beginning. The door to the chamber creaked open, its sound far too loud in the heavy silence. Kyle didn't lift his head. He didn't want to seem eager, though he could feel that something was about to change. The footsteps that echoed across the cold metal floor were steady, purposeful. Not like the guards shuffling, but like someone who knew they were in control. The air shifted as the figure stepped into view. Taller than he expected, her silhouette cut through the dim light. Misenna. She wasn't like the others. Green-skinned, yes, but there was something in the way she carried herself that screamed authority. A dark uniform clung to her figure like it had been sewn directly onto her skin, blonde hair cropped sharply at her jaw. And though she was alien, the weight of her presence was unmistakably human. This was a leader. Kyle lifted his head just slightly, locking eyes with her. He had been through hell, but his sharp, defiant gaze never wavered. There was a grim satisfaction in seeing that she didn't look away. "General Misenna, you're the one keeping me alive," he said, his voice rough from the blood and bruises. Misenna paused 2 steps from him, her gaze sweeping over him, cold and calculating. "Alive is subjective," she said in a voice that matched the chill of the room. "You override their kill orders. I don't waste assets." Kyle chuckled softly, despite the ache in his ribs. "That what I am? An asset?" he asked, testing her, feeling the weight of the words hanging between them. Misenna didn't answer right away, and for a moment, Kyle could have sworn he saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a flash of something deeper, more personal. But she quickly masked it, crossing her arms. "You've been difficult," she said finally, her tone flat, almost detached. "That's one word for it." "I can think of others," Kyle shot back, his smirk never faltering. She tilted her head slightly, almost like she was sizing him up, weighing her options. But before the silence could stretch too long, she got straight to the point. "Tell me where the data is," she demanded, her voice now colder, sharper. Kyle leaned forward as much as the restraints would allow, his eyes narrowing. "You think I'm here because I got caught?" His words were like a challenge, a taunt. "You're wasting time," he added, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. "I'm not just some prisoner you can break." Misenna's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes shifted. There was a subtle shift, almost imperceptible, but it was there. She took a step closer, her stance more aggressive now. "You think you're in the files?" she asked, her voice soft but intense. "What are you implying?" Kyle's grin widened, a flash of confidence sparking in his eyes. "You're not just a footnote," he said. "You're a section. Hell, you're practically the headline." Her eyes narrowed, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she turned sharply and walked to the door. She stopped just before leaving, her back still to him. Her voice was quiet when she spoke. "This is reckless, Kyle. If this is a tactic, it's dangerous." Kyle's gaze remained locked on her, unwavering. "No tactic," he said, his voice steady. "Just truth." Misenna hesitated for a moment before exiting, leaving him alone in the room. But Kyle knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Whatever she was hiding, whatever secrets were buried in those encrypted files, it was going to change everything. She was the key. And he had just made sure she knew it. This second part continues building the tension between Kyle and Misenna, giving more insight into her character and introducing the complexity of their relationship. It hints at deeper motivations, both tactical and personal, while keeping the suspense high. Let me know if you'd like to explore or adjust any aspect further. The hours passed like an eternity, the silence in the room now thick with unspoken words. Kyle was no stranger to being locked in a cage, but this felt different. The chill of the room, the weight of Misenna's gaze, it all made him realize something. She was not like the others. She wasn't here to just extract information, she was here to play a game of her own. When the door finally opened again, Misenna stepped inside. She didn't speak immediately, just stood there in the doorway, eyes scanning the room and then landing on him. He was still strapped to the chair, blood crusted at his lip, but his spirit hadn't broken. The flicker of something unfamiliar passed between them, but it was gone before it could be acknowledged. Misenna crossed the room slowly, her footsteps measured, calculated. "You're still alive," she said, her voice cool but tinged with something, almost like curiosity. "I thought you'd have cracked by now." "Guess you underestimated me," Kyle replied, his voice low but laced with a challenge. She tilted her head slightly, clearly intrigued by his resilience. "You didn't crack, but I'm sure you'll break eventually," she said with quiet certainty. "Everyone does." He grinned, blood staining his teeth. "I'm not everyone." Misenna paused for a moment, just watching him. It was the first time she truly studied him. "That much is clear?" She stepped closer, her presence overwhelming, the air between them charged. "You still haven't told me where the data is," she said, her voice softer now, almost coaxing, like she was trying to pull something out of him, something more than just the truth. "The truth might get you out of here alive, Kyle." He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. "What's the truth to you, General?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Do you even know what it is anymore?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she crossed her arms, studying him for a long moment, her gaze unyielding. "I know enough to see when someone's hiding something," she said, her voice sharp. "And I know you're hiding more than you've let on." Kyle leaned back in a chair, grinning despite the pain. "So you think you're the only one with secrets?" he asked, his eyes glinting with a mixture of amusement and challenge. "Maybe I know something about you that even you don't." Her eyes narrowed, the storm inside her visible for the first time. "I don't need you to teach me anything, Kyle." He smirked. "You sure about that?" Misenna didn't flinch. Instead, she moved closer, almost in defiance, her breath brushing against his ear as she spoke. "You have no idea who you're messing with," she whispered, her tone colder than ever. Kyle's grin widened. "I know exactly who you are," he said, his voice low. "And that's the problem." There was a long pause between them. A standoff, of sorts. The power dynamic was shifting. Both of them were realizing that their interactions had become something more than just interrogation. The line between enemy and ally was blurring, and the truth was, neither of them knew exactly where it would lead. For the first time, Misenna took a step back. Her eyes were still locked on his, but there was a flicker of hesitation in them. A vulnerability she couldn't hide, even if she tried. "You're right," she said quietly. "I don't know what to make of you." Kyle met her gaze, his voice softening, yet still filled with defiance. "Then you should be careful, General. Because the moment you stop seeing me as your prisoner, that's the moment things change." Misenna didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned on her heel, walking towards the door. "You're not my prisoner," she said without looking back, her voice tinged with something that could have been regret or maybe something more. "But you're not free, either." Kyle watched her leave, his heart racing not from the physical pain but from something far more dangerous, the knowledge that he was no longer the only one holding secrets. The hours that followed were tense, the silence in the room thick with unspoken words. Misenna was quieter now, her mind clearly at work. She hadn't spoken to Kyle since their last exchange, but Kyle knew she was thinking. He could feel the shift in the air, the moment when the game between them changed. There was no longer a clear line separating the interrogator from the prisoner. And for some reason, that made him feel alive in a way he hadn't in years. The door opened again, and this time, Misenna stepped inside. Her eyes locked with his, but there was something different in them now, no longer just cold calculation, but something deeper. She wasn't here to ask more questions. She was here to make a decision. "You want the truth, don't you?" Kyle asked, his voice steady despite the pain still coursing through his body. "I've had enough of your games," she replied, her tone sharp, but the flicker of doubt in her eyes betrayed her words. "I'm giving you a choice, Kyle." Kyle raised an eyebrow, the challenge in his gaze unyielding. "What choice?" She stepped closer, her boots clicking on the cold metal floor. "You can stay here and rot," she said, her voice low and dangerous, "or you can come with me and help me take down the people who think they can control everything." Kyle's heart skipped a beat. He didn't know what she meant by help, but he knew one thing: this was no longer about data or espionage. This was personal. Whatever decision he made now would change everything. He could see it in her eyes. She was offering him an out, but it wasn't just freedom. She was offering him a chance to fight back against the very system that had locked them both in this game. The question was whether he was ready to play her game or whether he could trust her enough to join forces. "What's the catch?" Kyle asked, his voice low, eyes narrowing as he scanned her face for any hint of deception. "You trust me, and I trust you," she said simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "And if we survive this, we'll have to decide whether or not we can trust each other enough to see it through." Kyle exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of her words. His mind raced, his options flickering like images in a kaleidoscope. Stay and die? Or walk out that door and face whatever Misenna had in mind, with a slim chance of surviving? "And if I say no?" he asked, pushing her, testing her resolve. Her gaze hardened, but there was no anger in it. "Then you'll die here, alone, without ever knowing what you could have been part of." Kyle laughed softly, a bitter, hollow sound that filled the empty room. "You're good," he said, the sarcasm clear. But despite the snark, there was something in him, a flicker of trust that made him consider her words more seriously than he wanted to admit. For a moment, they stood there in silence. The tension between them thick enough to cut with a knife. The weight of their choices lay heavy in the room, yet neither of them moved. "I'll go with you," Kyle said finally, his voice steady and certain. "But you better make sure we don't die in the process." A smile tugged at Misenna's lips, the first real smile he'd seen from her. It wasn't warm, but it was a smile of acknowledgement, like he'd passed some unspoken test. "Good," she said. "Then get ready. This won't be easy." Kyle stood, wincing slightly as the restraints were released. His body was sore, but the adrenaline pumping through his veins pushed aside the pain. As he stretched his arms, testing his muscles, he felt a strange sense of liberation, like he had just made the first move in a dangerous game. But the danger was far from over. They weren't just running from the authorities anymore. They were running towards something much more treacherous, the truth. "Where are we going?" Kyle asked as he followed Misenna toward the door, ready to leave the cold, sterile room behind. "We have to make sure the data gets out," she said as she led him into the dimly lit hallway. "There are people who are going to kill us the moment they find out we've escaped. But if we succeed, we can expose everything. And that's where the real fight begins." Kyle's heart raced again, not from fear but from the thrill of it all. "I'm in," he said, his voice unwavering. They walked together in silence, the weight of their choices heavy, but for the first time, Kyle felt like he was finally part of something bigger than himself. Whether that was good or bad didn't matter. What mattered now was the mission. And with Misenna, he knew he wasn't alone. The wind howled through the barren landscape as Misenna and Kyle crouched low, moving through the underbrush with practiced precision. They were no longer just two individuals caught in a web of conspiracy and betrayal. They had become a team, and with that unity came a strange sense of resolve. Their destination was the relay station, hidden deep in the wasteland, buried beneath the rubble of a war long past. This place, this forgotten relic of the invasion wars, held the key to everything, the data that could expose the corruption at the highest levels of the alien government. But it was more than that. It was their last chance. They knew the stakes. If they failed here, everything would be lost. Misenna would never be able to return to her post, her treason would be undeniable. And Kyle? He'd be a target for the rest of his life, hunted by those who saw him as a threat to their control. "We're almost there," Misenna whispered, her voice low, her tone sharp with concentration. She was a woman on the edge, her every move calculated, her every breath deliberate. But Kyle saw the flicker of something else in her eyes. A flash of fear? No, it wasn't fear. It was uncertainty, the kind that comes when you know there's no turning back. "Ready when you are," Kyle replied, voice steady despite the rush of adrenaline coursing through his veins. He adjusted his grip on the pulse rifle, the cold metal of the weapon grounding him in the moment. They reached the entrance of the station, a dark, abandoned structure half buried under centuries of dirt and dust. Misenna accessed the emergency lock and turned to Kyle. "You'll cover me. Stay hidden." He nodded, eyes scanning the area for any sign of movement. The wind kicked up, a faint echo of the chaos they were about to unleash. "Let's do this," Kyle muttered, more to himself than to her. Inside the relay station, Misenna moved with the grace and precision of someone who had been trained to lead an army, not just to fight in the shadows. Kyle followed closely behind, his eyes darting from corner to corner, alert to every sound and movement. As they reached the central hub of the station, Misenna tapped a few codes into the console. The data she needed was just within reach, but there was a catch. A final safeguard had been put in place, one designed to stop anyone from accessing the crucial files. "They've locked it down tighter than I expected," she muttered, frustration creeping into her voice for the first time. "I thought you had a plan," Kyle teased, his voice laced with a hint of a grin. "I do," she snapped. "Just not enough time to make it work." Kyle watched her fingers fly over the control panel, the tension mounting with every passing second. "What happens if we can't get it?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Then we fight," she replied, her voice cold, steady. "And we die trying." Suddenly, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the station. Kyle froze, his heart racing as the distant hum of enemy soldiers drew closer. He pressed himself against the wall, his pulse rising. "Misenna," Kyle whispered urgently, "we don't have much time." She didn't look up, her focus unshakable. "I need 2 more minutes." But Kyle could hear it, the unmistakable sound of heavy boots, the telltale click of weapons being readied. "They are almost here," he warned, his hand tight around his weapon. In a flash, Misenna finished typing in the last sequence. "Done," she said, and the screen flickered to life, displaying the encrypted data. But their time had run out. The first blast of energy hit the wall beside them, sending a jolt through the station. Kyle reacted instantly, returning fire with precision. The soldiers were coming, and they were armed to the teeth. "Move!" Misenna shouted as she dove behind cover, pulling Kyle with her. He fought alongside her, his movements instinctual. They weren't just surviving, they were making their stand. The room exploded into chaos, plasma blasts ricocheting off the walls, the hiss of energy weapons filling the air. "Cover me!" Misenna yelled, popping up from her cover to unleash a burst of fire. Kyle fired from his position, taking down 2 soldiers in rapid succession. The rest of the enemy team responded, but they weren't prepared for the fury of the 2 people fighting together. They moved like a well-oiled machine, synchronized in a way that only months of cover training could achieve. Misenna's movements were lethal, every strike, every shot calculated to bring down their attackers swiftly and without hesitation. But Kyle knew they couldn't keep this up forever. He saw the numbers, they were outgunned and outnumbered. "We need to get out of here," he shouted, his voice hoarse with effort. "Not yet," she growled, her eyes locked on the enemy's advancing position. "We're not done." In that moment, Kyle realized something about Misenna, something that had been lurking beneath the surface since their first encounter. She wasn't just fighting for survival. She was fighting for something more, something personal. She wasn't just a general. She was a woman who had been betrayed, and she would burn everything down to see the truth revealed. With a final, decisive strike, Misenna took down the last soldier, leaving the room eerily quiet. Kyle wiped the sweat from his brow, his heart still pounding from the fight. "You sure you don't want to just run now?" he asked, his voice heavy with the weight of their battle. "I'm not running anymore," she said, her voice steady as she stared at the data she had risked everything to retrieve. "And neither are you?" They stood there for a moment, catching their breath, the silence of the room settling around them like a heavy fog. The ground beneath their feet felt different now, less like the steady, cold metal of the relay station and more like the uncertain, shifting terrain of a world that had gone off course. Kyle and Misenna had emerged victorious, but the victory felt hollow. Their escape wasn't just a physical one, it was an emotional battle they hadn't fully anticipated. As they moved through the dense, fog-covered woods, the weight of what they'd just done hung in the air between them. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore, they were fighting for something deeper. Something more personal. They reached a hidden safe house, an old military bunker camouflaged beneath layers of earth and decay. The door slid open with a hiss, and Misenna stepped in first, her eyes scanning the dim interior. It wasn't much, just a bare room with a cot, a few supplies, and a terminal. But for the first time in what felt like forever, it was a place where they could breathe. The door clicked shut behind them, sealing them inside. Kyle's pulse still raced from the adrenaline, but the quiet of the bunker started to creep in, making the silence between them feel more intense. He glanced at Misenna, who was already moving toward the small terminal, her focus unwavering. "We're safe for now," she said, her voice colder than usual. "But not for long." Kyle didn't respond immediately. He knew she was right. They had little time before the government or their enemies would come after them again. But that wasn't what was on his mind right now. What really weighed on him was Misenna, the woman who had just made a choice that could cost her everything. He watched her as she started working, her fingers flying over the terminal. Her back was stiff, her shoulders tight with a burden of command. But there was something else there, too, a vulnerability, barely perceptible, that made him wonder what she was hiding from him. He couldn't shake the feeling that this moment, this safe house, wasn't just a stop on the way to a larger goal. It felt like a turning point. Something was changing, and Misenna wasn't the only one who felt it. "You don't have to do this alone," he said, his voice softer than usual. She didn't look up from the screen. "I never have," she replied, her voice distant, like she was already several steps ahead of him in her mind. "I just prefer it that way." Kyle stepped closer, his footsteps muffled against the concrete floor. He didn't know why he said it, but the words slipped out before he could stop them. "You don't have to hide it, you know. Whatever it is you're carrying." Misenna paused, her fingers hovering above the keys. There was a long moment of silence before she finally turned her head to face him. Her eyes were guarded, but there was a flicker of something else there, something deeper. "I don't have the luxury of letting anyone in," she said, her voice low. "Not now. Not after everything I've done." Kyle tilted his head, studying her. "You're wrong," he said quietly. "You're letting me in, whether you realize it or not." Misenna's gaze hardened, but there was no anger in it. Just a quiet sadness, like she was tired of fighting everything, tired of pretending she didn't need help. "I didn't sign up for this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "To care about anyone. Not you, not anyone." "But you do care," Kyle replied, stepping closer. "And that's the difference between you and them. You might not admit it, but I see it." There was a flicker of surprise in Misenna's eyes, and for a second, she seemed vulnerable in a way Kyle hadn't seen before. But she quickly masked it, looking back at the terminal as if she were searching for an escape. "I'm not your savior, Kyle," she said sharply, though her voice lacked its usual force. "I'm not here to save you. I'm here to finish what I started." Kyle didn't move, his gaze unwavering. "Then we'll finish it together?" Her lips twitched slightly, almost a smile, but quickly hidden behind the wall she had built. She looked away from him, focusing once again on the terminal. "I don't need you, Kyle," she said, but there was something in her tone now, something that made it sound less like a declaration and more like a question. He took a deep breath, stepping back as he gave her space. "No," he said, his voice steady. "You don't need me. But we both know we're better when we're together. You're not the only one who's been carrying a burden." For the first time, Misenna looked at him fully. "And what's your burden, Kyle?" His eyes met hers, his voice soft. "I'm not here to ask for your pity," he said. "But I can't fight this war alone. I've been fighting for survival, for a cause. But now, it's different. Now, I'm fighting for us. She studied him for a long time, her face unreadable. But Kyle could see the hesitation there, the flicker of something he couldn't quite put his finger on. Us, she whispered, as if the word tasted foreign on her tongue. She looked away, her fingers moving again over the terminal, but her movements were slower now, almost reluctant. The quiet tension between them grew, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that existed between two people who had crossed a line one they couldn't uncross. They were no longer just allies in a war. They were something more, something unspoken. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. And in that silence, something shifted. Kyle realized that this moment, this safe house, wasn't just a place for physical rest. It was a moment for them to rest emotionally, too. To let their guards down, even if only for a second. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were choosing each other. The world outside felt distant now, as if it had already moved on without them. But inside the small, dimly lit safe house, Kyle and Misenna existed in their own world. No longer just two soldiers fighting for survival, they had become something more, something neither of them had expected, and certainly not something either of them had planned for. But there was no denying it now. The silence between them was thick, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that came from a deep understanding and unspoken acknowledgement that they had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. And now, they both had to face what that meant. Kyle leaned against the wall, his eyes locked on the floor, his thoughts racing. Misenna was sitting on the cot, her posture rigid, her back straight despite the exhaustion that weighed her down. They hadn't said much since their conversation earlier, but the air between them was charged. They both knew that something had shifted. Something that couldn't be ignored. So, Kyle broke the silence, his voice steady but carrying an edge of something raw. What now? Misenna didn't immediately respond. She ran a hand through her blonde hair, pushing it back from her face as if trying to clear her mind. The silence stretched on, but it wasn't awkward. It was the quiet of two people who knew they had to face the reality of what was coming next. There was no time to waste on the past, no room for second guessing. We move, she said at last, her voice calm, but there was an underlying weight to her words. We finish this, Kyle. We expose the truth. Kyle took a deep breath, pushing off from the wall to stand a little taller. And after that, his voice was low, but there was something deeper in it now, a flicker of hope, of something that wasn't just about survival. Misenna's eyes flicked up to meet his, and for a moment, they held each other's gaze. There was a vulnerability in her eyes that she hadn't shown before, something that spoke to the heart of the battle they were fighting, not just against the system, but against everything that had been building between them. We figure it out, she said finally, her voice softer than before, as if she was finally allowing herself to speak the truth. We deal with what comes next. Together. Kyle's chest tightened at her words, and for a second, he almost felt like he couldn't breathe. This wasn't just about the mission anymore. This wasn't just about survival or fighting for a cause. It was about something that ran deeper than that. He moved toward her, his steps slow, deliberate, as if he were testing the ground beneath him. Testing the boundaries they had just crossed. You're not scared, are you? He asked softly, his eyes searching hers. Scared, she repeated, her brow furrowing in confusion. Of what? Of this, Kyle said, his voice barely above a whisper. Of us. For a long moment, Misenna didn't say anything. She just stared at him, her expression unreadable, but her eyes spoke volumes. He could see the conflict swirling beneath the surface. He could see her struggle to keep her walls intact, to maintain control, to keep the power balance in her favor. But then something shifted. Something broke free in her. I don't know what this is, she admitted, her voice barely audible, but her words hung in the air, thick with truth. But I can't pretend it isn't real. Kyle's heart raced at her words, and without thinking, he stepped closer. There was no plan, no strategy, just instinct, just the undeniable pull that had been growing between them ever since they first met. "Misenna," he whispered, his voice rough, filled with something raw that neither of them had ever voiced before. She looked up at him, her breath shallow, and in that moment, the last of their walls crumbled. Without another word, she reached for him, her fingers trembling slightly as she closed the space between them. The air was thick with unspoken tension, with the weight of everything they had both been avoiding. And then, just as their lips were about to meet, the door to the safe house slammed open, the sound so loud it felt like a physical blow. Kyle pulled back instinctively, his hand on his weapon, ready for whatever was coming next. Misenna was already on her feet, her posture shifting from vulnerable to commanding in a blink of an eye. But Kyle didn't move. He didn't take his eyes off Misenna. Not this time. "Stay close," she murmured, her eyes hardening with purpose. The moment was gone, the fleeting tenderness evaporated, replaced by the cold reality of what they were up against. The intrusion had shattered the moment, but neither of them could afford to let it disrupt their resolve. They had crossed a line, and neither of them was turning back now. Whatever happened next, whatever danger awaited them, it didn't matter. They had already made their choice. The sharp ring of the emergency alarm echoed through the bunker, cutting through the brief silence that had descended between Kyle and Misenna. They didn't need to say anything to each other. The moment they had just shared, however brief, was already in the past, buried beneath the urgency of their situation. Misenna's hand was already on her sidearm before the sound had even faded. Kyle's instincts kicked in immediately, his heart pounding as he scanned the room for potential threats. He had known this wasn't going to be easy. They couldn't afford the luxury of distractions. Not with the kind of enemies they were up against. "We're running out of time," Misenna muttered under her breath, moving swiftly towards the weapons locker. She didn't look at Kyle, her focus entirely on the task at hand. Kyle nodded, but there was something else beneath the surface of his thoughts. Something about her, about what they had just almost done, stirred an unfamiliar restlessness in him. But now wasn't the time for distractions. He had to keep his mind clear. "Get ready," she ordered, pulling out a small, compact device from the locker. "We're not just running anymore. We're going to take the fight to them." Kyle's eyes flickered to the device she was holding. It was a specialized COMM relay, designed to bypass most standard security measures. The fact that Misenna had one of these meant she was planning something big and risky. "Where are we headed?" Kyle asked, trying to keep his voice steady, despite the adrenaline surging through him. "To the heart of their operations," she replied, her voice filled with grim resolve. "We're going to make sure they know we're coming. No more hiding." They moved quickly through the darkened corridors of the bunker, the sounds of distant explosions and gunfire echoing from outside. Misenna led the way, her pace steady, her eyes narrowed with focus. Kyle followed close behind, his mind racing. He had known the risks from the beginning, but now, everything felt different. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were taking the fight to the enemy, and for the first time in a long while, Kyle felt like they were playing on their terms. As they reached the secure exit, Misenna stopped for a moment, looking back at him. "This is it, Kyle," she said, her tone low but filled with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine. "There's no going back." Kyle's heart thudded in his chest, but he didn't hesitate. "I'm ready," he said, his voice steady. The outside world was a war zone. The landscape was scarred, buildings half collapsed and burning in the distance, and the air was thick with the smell of smoke and gunfire. They made their way through the ruined city streets, keeping to the shadows as much as possible. The relays they had activated earlier gave them a temporary advantage, masking their position from the enemy's surveillance systems. But it wouldn't last long. The enemy would adapt quickly, and soon they would be hunting them down again. But Misenna wasn't concerned about being hunted. She was concerned about something else, something far more dangerous. She was here to finish what they had started. To expose the truth, no matter the cost. They finally arrived at a hidden relay station, a fortified compound buried beneath the remnants of an old government building. Misenna quickly hacked into the security system, her fingers moving with lightning speed as she bypassed layer after layer of encryption. "We've got a window," she said, her voice grim. "But it's only going to be open for a few minutes. We need to make sure the data gets out." Kyle nodded, his hand steady on his pulse rifle. "I'll cover you." As she worked, Kyle kept watch. Every sound, every movement was amplified in the stillness of the night. He could feel the weight of the mission pressing on him, the realization that they were on the edge of something monumental. Whatever happened now would change everything, not just for them, but for the entire war. The countdown to their next move was ticking down, and Misenna was focused entirely on the task at hand. She was so close to bringing down the system that had betrayed her, the same system that had kept Kyle in its grasp for far too long. Finally, with a soft beep, the data transmission was complete. Misenna stepped back from the console, her face hard with determination. "It's done," she said, a hint of satisfaction in her voice. Kyle's eyes narrowed as he scanned the area around them. "We need to move. They'll know what we've done." "I know." Misenna was already heading towards the exit. "And they won't stop until we're dead." But they didn't die. They didn't even come close. Instead, they kept moving. Every step they took was a declaration of defiance, every breath a testament to their resolve. And just like that, a human prisoner and an alien general stepped off the battlefield. No longer enemies. No longer pawns in someone else's game. Now, they are two rebels bound by secrets powerful enough to burn down an empire. Kyle, the man who refused to break. Misenna, the commander once forged in obedience, now torn between duty and something far more dangerous, feeling. Together, they didn't just survive execution. They challenged the system itself. But this war has only just begun. With the eyes of the galaxy turning toward them. With the most powerful leaders starting to feel threatened. Can this bond survive betrayal and bloodshed? Or will they become the next targets? If you found this story gripping, don't forget to hit subscribe, leave a comment, and turn on notifications. There are still truths buried deep beneath the surface. And in the next chapter, we'll find out what happens when a fallen general and a captured spy fall for each other. Welcome to the world of Alien Chronicles. See you in the next episode.